Welcome. Good morning to those who are in Asia and good evening to those who are in New York or in the United States. Welcome to this evening's panel on migrant worker rights in Singapore. Before we get started, I want to thank Columbia University's Weatherhead East Asian Institute and the program Asia in Action, which is sponsoring the event tonight, along with the New York Southeast Asian Network. And thankfully, we have some tech support from New York Southeast Asian Network so that we are not adrift in technology. We have a terrific session tonight, and we're really looking forward to a robust discussion. I'm going to introduce our two speakers and my fellow moderator, and then I'm going to turn it over to them. I'd love to take questions if you can put them in the chat, and then when we're done, I'll try and keep track of the order, and hopefully we'll have a lively discussion. So let me do some introductions. Debbie Fordyce is the current president of Transient Workers Count Too, TWC2, having volunteered with the organization for more than 15 years. She sets up and manages the free meal program that offers daily meals and advice and referrals for male workers not permitted to work due to claims for injury compensation or salary non-payment. Through these daily discussions, she's learned about the causes and problems of the recruitment process and the Singapore work permit system that causes indebtedness and job precarity, especially among Bangladeshi workers in the construction and marine sectors. She also contributes to TWC2's research, communication, and public engagement teams. And we're really fortunate that she could make time to be with us because she has extensive knowledge really on the ground of what the conditions that the migrant workers are facing. Our second panelist tonight is Laavanya Kathiravelu. She is an associate professor in the School of Social Sciences at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Her research lies at the intersections of international migration, race and ethnic studies, and contemporary urban diversity, particularly in Asia and the Persian Gulf. She's published widely on issues of race, inequality, and migration in Singapore. Prior to joining NTU, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity, and she served as a Fung Fellow at Princeton University. Laavanya is a board member of the migrant welfare organization HOME, as well as civil society group AWARE, whose aim is to advance gender equality. She comments regularly in public forums and through op-eds on issues of migration, race, and diversity in Singapore. And recently, she was a Fulbright Scholar at the City University here in New York. I'm also joined tonight by my very longtime friend and colleague, Anne-Marie Murphy, who is a research fellow at the Weatherhead East Asian Institute at Columbia with me, and a professor at Seton Hall at the Whitehead School of Diplomacy. And Anne-Marie and I have lots of prior work experience together on common interests relating to foreign policy and domestic politics in Southeast Asia. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Debbie, and the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much for having me. Let me put my screen up, and then here we go. Where is that? Okay, everyone can see that fine? Okay, this is Shagar. He's been a good friend of mine for over 10 years. And like many of migrant workers in Singapore, he's stuck in a position where he can't go home because his family wouldn't be able to survive without him sending money, and he can't make a life here in Singapore. So this is a type of circular migration that's common in a lot of countries, including Singapore. It's where migrants tack back and forth, typically making a number of trips between home and abroad in the course of their working life. So that means long periods of separation from family and virtually no prospect of settling in the country where they work. It's a lifelong temporariness where migration is fundamentally different from the permanent forms of emigration that resulted from earlier mass movements. For example, enslavement, indentured labor systems, or voluntary migration. And it's different because those earlier situations often meant that people never returned to their country of origin. So this circular migration has allowed Singapore to maximize economic utility while minimizing social costs. This type of migration has become very common in the last few decades, and it's a feature of rich countries that have stagnating or negative population growth and whose residents are not willing to engage in dirty work or the dirty work that's required for these large infrastructure projects. It's also seen as a solution to the dual crisis of labor shortage in wealthy countries and unemployment in poor countries. In Bangladesh, where most of TWC2's clients are from, this temporary migration is encouraged by the Bangladesh government because it reduces unemployment at home, it prevents young men from getting involved in gangs, drugs, or religious extremism, and it relieves the government of the responsibility for providing the infrastructure that would be required for them to make a living at home. The sending countries also welcome the remittances from abroad, as this provides international currency that they need for projects, and it supports the government in power. The oil boom in 1973 led to a rapid increase in this demand for foreign labor in the 6 Gulf countries. And foreigners in the Gulf countries are now 50%, and in a country like this, Dubai, it's 95%. Here's Singapore. So it's commonly thought that migration equally benefits the receiving and the sending countries, but we should question that assumption. In Singapore, with the increasing segregation of low-wage workers, they've become almost an invisible class of people. And that prevents Singapore residents from considering the exploitative and often inhumane nature of their work and living conditions. The common notion of happy workers is promoted by the government-controlled media, which gives reassurances that Singapore provides satisfactory systems and safety nets for migrant workers. And that also reinforces the local and the international view of Singapore as one of the Asian tigers and as an economic miracle. So this restrictive system of regulating workers is called the Kafala System. The term was first used in the Gulf countries, but it also applies in many other countries, including Singapore. The Kafala system prevents unskilled migrants from bringing in their family. It ties them to a single employer, and so job mobility is not permitted. It disallows them from marrying locals, and it provides no path to residency, and it enforces other restrictions on their rights and movement. Singapore started to bring in large numbers of migrant workers in the 1980s, when shipyards, construction, and manufacturing became a major part of the economy. And Singapore required more cheap labor to do the 3D work. Singaporeans were richer, better educated, and no longer willing or able to do the manual work or the domestic work of cleaning and looking after children and the elderly. As Singapore started to deal with COVID, things seemed to be going quite well until the virus spread like wildfire through dormitories where the male workers were housed. And for all of its laudatory efforts to protect Singaporeans from the pandemic, the government hadn't given much thought to migrant workers. So what looked like a highly successful response to COVID-19 was found to have overlooked completely the crowded and confined conditions of the dormitories. This illustrates the long-term problem with Singapore's attitude towards migrant workers. Their labor is vital to the Singapore economy, but they're treated as though they're invisible, except when they're seen as causing problems or when they suffer accidents or abusive behavior that briefly grabs the headlines. Since transient workers aren't considered part of the community, There's little meaningful interaction between residents and low-wage workers. And that also adds to the general ignorance and the acceptance among Singaporeans of the way that migrants are treated. Statistics here. So foreign employees in Singapore are distinguished according to their skills and their salary levels. The majority of the workers that TWC2 assists are defined as work permit holders. They're paid the least, they have no minimum salary, and their employers can terminate them at will. So this gives employers considerable power over the workers. The workers are right to fear that if they object to how they're treated, or if they complain, they'll lose their job and be sent home. Newly arrived workers are especially fearful, having paid considerable recruitment fees to obtain the job. What they pay is the equivalent of about 1 to 2 years of their salary, which is about US $6,000 to $7,000. Bangladesh workers typically have no written contract. They're made to sign documents that they aren't allowed to read or retain, and they work under constant threat of termination. Almost 300,000 male workers are employed in the CMP sectors. That's construction, marine, and process. That's 20% of all non-residents. For the skilled pass workers and the employment pass holders, the minimum salary was recently raised, and that's to prevent foreigners from taking jobs from Singaporeans. But the work permit holders don't enjoy the minimum salary, and the most common salary we see among these men is US $370 a month, $500 Singapore. We've seen less than that, and we occasionally see more. That's what the salary was about 20 years ago, and that's what it still is now. So it was enough 20 years ago to maintain a family, but certainly not now. So transient workers are productive, but dispensable and replaceable non-citizens, subject to practices and regulations that are legal and normalized within the world of migrant workers. Here's my friend, another friend, Leon, who I got to know because he was scammed. He paid the recruitment fees for the company, and the company never provided him any work. But let's talk about why they come. There are scarce opportunities for jobs or social mobility, especially in Bangladesh. And yet they pay this high price. To get that money, they need to borrow from money lenders at huge rates of interest, and that risks the economic stability of their family. The family is affected in two ways, as the money flows in both directions. The outflow of family resources to meet the economic cost of migration, and the transfer back to the families in the form of remittances. But as I said, the debt is equal to 1 to 2 years of their salary. And so given that the workers are first required to provide for the family's needs, they could be trapped in debt for 10 to 15 years or for the entire time that they spend working abroad. This perpetual debt cycle means the only option is to continue working abroad to maintain the family while at the same time trying to reduce the debt. For many, the high interest rates from predatory lenders and the increasing demands from family create an inescapable force tying them to the job and preventing them from complaining, demanding their rights, or asking for better pay and conditions. TWC2 is sometimes asked to identify workers, to speak to the media or local groups about their experiences. And too often we find that their conversation focuses on the details of their daily life, the low wages, the long hours, poor quality food, crowded dorms, long wait for toilet and shower, bed bugs, abusive language or threats from the boss, and dangerous transportation to and from the work site. And while all these things are true, pervasive, and unacceptable, they're not illegal. So the crippling effects of indebtedness are harder for workers to explain. That's partly because obtaining a job within Bangladesh would also require a huge bribe or kickback even larger, in fact, than what the labor agents demand for the job in Singapore. So it's as if the fees paid to brokers and middlemen are like a necessary and unavoidable fact of life. Liton's parents and his brother's young son. Supporting the family means paying for food, education, medical care, providing social and religious ceremonies to raise or maintain the family's social position, marrying off sisters and daughters, and house building. So a bit more about social standing. When someone is working abroad, he's seen by his family as a money machine, and there's a popular song about that. If he's at home, he'd be seen as a loser. If he's working abroad, no matter what he's doing, he's a hero. But if for some reason he's no longer able to work due to injury, a salary claim, or some other problem, he is very likely to withhold that information from his family and make excuses about why he hasn't been able to send money home. Meanwhile, the family still expects to show off their position by conspicuous consumption and house building. The family insists that the money machine remain abroad, well aware that once he comes back home, the money stops. I'll also talk about some of the assumptions that we have to deal with here in Singapore. One is that they're not well educated, but in fact, the families are not poor. They're usually far better educated than they would need to be for the work they do here. And then they should be grateful because they're getting rich while they work here. Well, if they were paid as they were promised and they were able to switch jobs and they were not burdened by recruitment fees, that would be true. Then they say, he should have known better. Well, people who are desperate will take greater risks everywhere. Then people say, he'll pick up the kind of skills that will help him start a business at home. Construction in Singapore isn't quite the same as construction in Bangladesh, as you can see from the picture. Dorms. Before COVID, workers were permitted to stay in a number of different types of accommodations, like purpose-built dorms, factory-converted dorms, temporary quarters, on-site housing, and also in residential areas. So until 2020, workers could make use of private condos or unapproved dorms situated in popular areas that cater to migrants. They could move around freely. They could access shops, food, places of worship, open spaces. They could socialize with friends, meet other workers, even engage in romantic relationships. But over the years, there were gradual measures that were taken to reduce their presence among Singapore residents. One big push to clear migrant workers from popular spots was a riot that occurred in December 2013. An Indian man was run over by a bus and killed as he attempted to board the bus. Things got out of hand and onlookers smashed and set fire to emergency vehicles. The government said about 300 people were involved. 33 were charged in court, 53 were deported for offenses such as obstructing the police and failing to follow orders to disperse. This led to the implementation of a new law banning public consumption of alcohol at night and at all times within the area where that riot occurred. But because many of the shops in that area relied on the sale of alcohol, that resulted in many of the local shops having to shut down, and also a curfew was placed on the buses that ferried workers back to dorms from that area. This is typical of a factory converted dorm. But I want to talk about those outside, the dormitories outside the designated and approved housing. Before COVID, about a third of the low-wage workers could live outside designated dorms. And these places were often dirty and crowded, but they were preferable because of their proximity to commercial spots and public transportation, and because of the ease of entry and exit. When lockdown forced migrant workers to move into approved dorms, new dorms had to be built, often with more square footage per person, with fewer men sharing toilet and shower facilities. But the dorms were all situated far from the community, making it harder to access commercial and recreational spaces. And the new dorms all came with security measures to monitor and to limit entry and exit. When lockdown was lifted and work was resumed, men were permitted to leave dorms only to go to work. Accessing popular gathering spots has become possible, but more expensive and time-consuming now because of the restrictions that are placed on the movement and the freedom of workers. And this has contributed greatly to the deteriorating emotional well-being of workers. Okay, a bit now about what TWC2 does. We were set up mainly as an advocacy organization. And among our advocacy issues, one of the longest ones has been a mandatory, non-negotiable day off for domestic workers. We started this campaign in 2003, and it is expected to take effect in 2023, 20 years later. For male workers, we've long fought for things like salary payments through banks rather than in cash, for itemized salary slips, and we've had some success with this, or I shouldn't say we've had success, but there have been changes made in these areas. Our major issue now is with job mobility and recruitment costs. So one of the ways to reduce recruitment costs would be to set up some sort of job matching platform where they could find jobs online without having to make use of rent-seeking labor agents in the process. So these two things, job mobility and lowering or eliminating recruitment costs, would drastically reduce many of the injustices and irregularities that we presently observe among migrant workers. One of the other things we do is direct services. These are services that are mainly to workers who are not permitted to work because of a salary claim or an injury claim. If they have salary problems, but they're not willing to lodge a claim, there's not much we can do. If they do lodge a claim, they won't be able to continue working. We sometimes pay for medical costs, and sometimes small amounts, but even large amounts. Singapore has hefty medical subsidies for Singapore residents, but this is not available for workers. So migrant workers, of course, are more likely to be involved in traumatic accidents than Singaporeans. And there is mandatory insurance, but there's a cap to it. And when the cost of medical care exceeds the mandatory insurance, the relationship between employer and employee quickly becomes strained or even hostile. As far as salary claims, we deal a lot, we advise, we assist workers in laying out what they're claiming for, and we sometimes will provide pro bono lawyers if it's a legal case that requires that. If the lawyer does take up the case, we're still required to remain on the case because we're needed to be there to guide and interpret and to reassure the client. The final thing, research and recommendations. On our website, we have thousands of articles and research papers related to the issue that the issues we've identified, and usually with suggestions about what could be done to remedy the problem. Our free meal program. So this is a service that I set up in 2008, and it's been ongoing since then. We offer meals 11 times a week. So on 6 days of the week, mornings and afternoons, mornings and evenings, Monday through Friday. Before the pandemic, we would have over 300 people coming to us every evening. Now, because things are just starting to loosen up, we have about 70 people coming to us. They come and ask for advice, casework help, sometimes transportation money. Our social workers, our 2 social workers are often on staff to deal with some of those things as well. So this is where we have our face-to-face, and it's in a popular spot in front of a popular restaurant. So this is how I spend most of my time and what I particularly enjoy doing. This is my final slide. And I like this quote because I think it's true. But because it mentions human rights, I've been asked sometimes not to use this quote because human rights is a sensitive topic. And apparently, even to mention a term that's not supposed to be used or talked about is seen as provocative. So many other countries, many other destination countries do speak about human rights. We've heard a lot about that from Qatar, but we know that Singapore won't be swayed by any of these kinds of arguments. But Singapore, on the other hand, is one country that could and should be able to improve conditions for workers. It's a small, wealthy country with an efficient government that can act quickly when necessary, but the economy still comes first. So as Yo Guo Kwan says here, at the end of the day, whatever factors help us to sustain the growth of the economy for the benefit of our countrymen, for the benefit of our country, we will go for it. So I think Singapore should go beyond that. Okay, thank you very much. I'll stop sharing.
Great. Thank you, Debbie. I think there are going to be a lot of follow-up questions about the work that you do. So thank you for introducing and going through a lot of that. Laavanya, I'd love to hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Amy. Let me just share my screen. So, yeah, I wanted to say thank you for this invitation to Anne-Marie and Amy. And I've fond memories of sharing my research from my book in 2016 when I gave a talk at the Weatherhead East Asia Institute in person back then in New York. So that was, this is nice to be back after 6 years. Yeah, so thank you so much for the opportunity. So today, I think Debbie's talk was excellent and a tough act to follow, I think. But I think Debbie really was helpful in terms of setting up the larger structure of the immigration regime in Singapore in relation to low-wage migrants. And I want to focus, I guess, more in terms of the everyday impact on low-wage migrants, low-wage migrant men in particular, looking at some of the effects, of COVID-19. My slides are getting ahead of me. And to talk a little bit as well about some of the developments that we saw during COVID-19 in relation to increased surveillance that I think Debbie kind of pointed to, but also perhaps potential for advocacy, but not to overstate that, but also talk about the limits of that, right? So first I want to focus on the immigration regime in terms of two aspects of it. So Debbie showed us in a pie chart, a really useful pie chart about how the population is broken down into citizens, permanent residents, and different types of migrants, right? So geographer Brenda Yo has talked about this as a bifurcated migration scheme. So it's really along lines of class, where you have very highly skilled migrants who come when employment passes. And in contrast to what Debbie told us about low-wage migrants not being able to bring their families, not being able to access citizenship, employment pass holders have that pathway to citizenship. They can become citizens eventually, they can bring their families in when they come. So it's very divided along those lines of status, along lines of what is considered skilled and unskilled, and really socioeconomic status lines. Right. So one is considered long-term, and these people are seen as maybe being included as part of the nation, potential citizens, and the other group as temporary, disposable. Right. And this has big implications, as we know, for a sense of precarity for low-wage migrants, because they don't have any access to permanency in Singapore. And as Debbie mentioned, their work passes could be revoked at any time by the employers, because the work pass is linked to a specific company, to a specific employer. So that power to revoke the work pass is tied to that employer and to that job. So this results in a lot of precarity, but also a lot of power on the part of the employer to define how, I guess, their employees can work, and define other parts of leisure, as well as I'll talk about later. The other part of the immigration regime that perhaps is less talked about is the ways in which it is ethnicized or racialized, right? So for low-wage migrants, there are specific countries from which low-wage migrants can be hired. So for instance, we see no low-wage migrants from countries like Russia, from Sweden, from the United States, even from Latin America. So compared to the United States that has a large kind of Latin American population working as irregular migrants in low-wage jobs, we don't have this in Singapore because there are only specific source countries, that's how it's termed in the discourse here, that we can draw low-wage migrants from. So I've got a table below here that I've extracted from the Ministry of Manpower website that shows different source countries. So that Malaysia, which is our direct neighbor, of course, you know, that's a traditional source country, and then they're non-traditional source countries. So most of the low-wage migrants we see come from the non-traditional source countries. So Bangladesh, Debbie talked about, but also India, Myanmar, Philippines, and China. So with low-wage migrant men, I think the biggest proportions would come from Bangladesh, from India and China, but also some from Sri Lanka, Thailand, Philippines, and Myanmar. There used to be larger proportions of migrants from places like South Korea decades ago, but due to the increasing, I guess, prosperity of places like South Korea and Taiwan, it's no longer viable, I think, for men to come and work in low-wage jobs in Singapore. So what the significance, though, of the ways in which this immigration regime is stratified is important because there is a link between this larger structure of how the regime is stratified and the ways in which migrants are treated in everyday life and the ways in which they're perceived, right? So on one hand, there is that class bifurcation. These migrants are seen as low wage, they're seen as unskilled, not quite perhaps worthy of applying for citizenship and permanent residency. And on the other hand, they come from a very specific set of countries. So there is also an ethnicization of this group, right? So you will never see people who look a particular way, especially people who are Asian, right? So you'll never see anyone who looks European who's doing like a low-wage migrant job. Or if they are, they're probably a foreman or a contractor, someone who's paid more and considered more skilled on a different work path, possibly. So the combination of this kind of ethnicization based on nationality and ethnicity and class, I think, creates an environment where low-wage migrants are seen in specific ways, right? And this leads to exclusion. So not just at the structural level in terms of the ways in which they're kept out of the residential areas or city centers in Singapore, as Debbie talked about before, but also in terms of everyday treatment, right? And I'm going to show you a couple of examples or quotes here from some of my field work or my ethnography, my working with migrant workers. And often these are linked to the kinds of work that they do, but also racialized in particular ways, right? So here, Murli talks about how no one wants to sit next to us sometimes on the train, or people will get up when we sit next to them because, we might smell after working a full day. And he says, even if they're Indian, so, he's Indian, and even if someone else is of Indian ethnicity, there is no kind of ethnic affinity that they understand, on that basis, but they still won't sit next to us, right? So I think the link I want to make here is between these kind of stratifications at the level of immigration regime and the kind of everyday exclusions that also entails, right? This kind of looking down on or not wanting to associate with people who do this kind of dirty, dangerous work. Another sign here from a block of flats where there was renovation going on. So all the toilets in this block of flats were being renovated. So residents had to use a public toilet on the ground floor. And there was a sign outside the toilet saying, workers do not use temporary toilet. And any Singaporean reading this sign or anyone living in Singapore reading this sign will immediately know what workers refers to. it refers, not to, a worker, someone who goes to work, but it refers to migrant workers and low-wage migrant men, right? So the sense of, these are spaces or rights that are only available to certain people, right? The residents, not the workers. So these kind of everyday exclusions are very common and that migrant workers talk about, right, as part of their experience in Singapore. This is a Facebook post that I took a screenshot of. And this woman talks about how an Indian foreign worker gave up his seat to her. And she joked and asked him if, he thought I was pregnant. Is that why you're giving up your seat? And he says, you Singaporean, you sit, I worker. So there's even this kind of bifurcated policy is internalized by migrant workers, where they themselves are made to feel and may not feel like they have equal access to spaces and to rights, even to sit on the train, to have a seat on the train as much as Singaporeans. So these are some of the ways in which we see everyday exclusion playing out, right? The kinds of policy level exclusions and how they play out in terms of how people internalize these norms of who is deserving, who is not, who is welcome in the country and who is not, and how they play out in terms of everyday interactions. Of course, I'm not suggesting that, every Singaporean is this way, or that people always behave this way. But what I'm trying to say is that, these policies do not just affect migrants in terms of, whether they can work here, what jobs they can work here, where they live, but they also affect relations between migrant workers and the rest of the community, the rest of society, and how they're perceived. And this has real implications for the kinds of support for the work of advocacy and speaking on behalf of migrant workers. So next, I want to move on a little bit to talk about COVID-19 and migrant workers. So as Debbie mentioned, low-wage migrant men in dormitories bore the brunt of COVID-19, especially in 2020 at the beginning of the pandemic. So as of August 2021, in low-wage migrant men who lived in dormitories accounted for 82.4% of COVID cases in Singapore. But citizens and permanent residents only accounted for 9.8%. So that's a huge difference. I don't have more recent statistics, but I think this is quite stark as it is, right? So you can see how the pandemic has affected this group a lot more than other groups in Singapore. So as part of COVID-19, there was forced repatriation. So because a lot of work stopped, people were forced to return back to their home countries. This meant, of course, that they could not keep paying their debts, and they could not pay back the money that they had loaned in order to come to Singapore. There was also a lack of work in some sectors, but simultaneously, because of these forced repatriations, because employers did not want to pay for migrant workers who were not doing any work, there was also manpower shortages. It was kind of this imbalanced situation. For some migrants who wanted to return and be with their family back home, they were not allowed to leave the country. There were no flights, they were too expensive, or employers were not allowing them to return. So, and of course, what we heard a lot about were forced confinements, right? People who could not leave their dormitories, could not leave the places where they lived, sometimes because employers did not allow them to leave, but other times because of governmental level orders that made people stay within confined spaces. And as Debbie mentioned, there's still ongoing restrictions to mobility. So I'll talk a bit more about this later, and how these ongoing restrictions to mobility are seen as really unfair and unequal by migrants themselves. But I guess the silver lining, if we want to see it that way, is that public sentiments in regards to migrant workers was really on the high especially during 2020 and 2021, because there was a lot of awareness about how these low-wage migrants were suffering the brunt of COVID. And I think there was some kind of shared sense of we're in this together, but also a lot of people who didn't know that there were 1 million low-wage migrants in Singapore heard about this finally with COVID-19. And so we saw at home, the NGO that I work with, we saw a lot more donations, we saw a lot more volunteering or gifts in kind, and people were doing a lot more, even outside these organizations. There was a lot more organic reaching out to the migrant worker community. So with COVID-19 though, we did also see how this kind of racialized, ethnicized migration regime has effects in terms of who to blame, right, for the spread of COVID-19. So in the US, of course, there was a lot of anti-Asian hate. There was a lot of racism because this virus was seen as coming from China. A lot of Asian Americans faced violence and racism because of this. And in Singapore, this took also a racialized effect to some extent. And because a lot of low-wage migrant men are from India and Bangladesh, there was a bit of the discourse around migrant workers, poor hygiene and bad habits. And because they are seen as lower class migrants, they obviously don't have good hygiene, they don't have understanding of public health, and therefore they're spreading this virus. So there wasn't an acknowledgement that they live in these tight conditions where the virus can spread so easily. And also because there wasn't as much public education about the virus aimed at this community like there was at the rest of the Singaporean resident population. Right, so it was racialized in these specific ways, and I think we can think about how this is linked again to this migration regime, right, that draws from specific source countries. Here, earlier I talked about how there's still mobility restrictions on migrant workers, right, and this is a screen grab I got again from the Ministry of Manpower website, and it talks about staggered rest days. So this means that migrants there's advisory that all migrant workers shouldn't have a rest day on Sunday, but to reduce crowding in spaces, that their rest day should be staggered throughout the week. And in principle, this sounds like a very good idea, right? To reduce spread, to reduce crowding. But this only applies to people on work permits, so the low-wage migrants, right? Singapore citizens, permanent residents, employment pass holders who are the higher wage migrants, and their dependents, who are their wives, their children, are not subject to this. So this is a policy that specifically only targets one group of people based on their immigration status. And this question says, will the Ministry of Manpower inform my workers? Also note the kind of language of my workers, the language of ownership, right, in this in these websites. And the answer is no, the ministry will not inform the migrant worker, but as the employer has a responsibility of informing the migrant worker. And the employer also has the ability to change on which day the migrant worker is able to rest. So the employer decides, okay, next week, you'll have a rest on Tuesday instead of Wednesday, and they forget to tell the migrant worker until Monday night, the migrant worker might have made plans already, but this is not within their control. And this is really an extension of the control that employers already have of migrants. And one of the things that we saw with COVID is with extension of this control in terms of the mobility of migrants to deciding, when they can, for example, apply for a pass to go to a place like Little India, and when they can take a rest day. So these kind of restrictions on mobility that didn't exist after COVID now exist, right? And Debbie mentioned the Little India, what's considered the Little India riots of 2013, where low-wage migrants were, accused and they destroyed a lot of public vehicles like ambulances and police vehicles. And as a result of that, there were these restrictions on alcohol consumption. And now these restrictions have actually extended to many other parts of Singapore as well. And we see this as something that happens with low-wage migrants, right? The kinds of control that are first perhaps instituted on this group of people is sometimes extended to other parts of the population as well. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later on. So here I have a quote from Ravi, who's a welder. So I did some interviews and field work with migrants in 2021, and in 2020 during the coronavirus pandemic. So a lot of this data is coming from there. And here, I put this quote up here because the COVID-19 pandemic really made this situation of debt bondage that Debbie talked about very stark, because debt bondage necessitates a constant flow of capital, of money that is sent back home, because there's this necessity to pay money every month in order to pay off your debt. Otherwise, your interest increases, you have to pay more back. But during COVID-19, when work stopped and some employers did not pay their migrants, or they only paid them a very basic salary, didn't pay them enough that they had money to pay back their debt. And it became a really dire situation for a lot of people. They got further in debt because they didn't have savings. They don't have, this community typically doesn't have the kind of economic capital to cushion these delays or disruptions to paying back their debt, right? And families back home too don't have the money to live on, savings to live on. They rely on this constant remittance to live, to build their home. So it really brought this issue of debt bondage into stark relief when there were these stoppages to payment and to work. And this quote is from a migrant who talks about how he had to buy all his masks and gloves. And this was true, perhaps, especially in the early days of COVID-19. And this, again, I put this quote up here because I think it speaks to how the migrant experience is often defined hugely by what kind of employer you get. So if you have a good employer who is who's cognizant of this situation, who realizes it costs a lot of money to buy these supplies, and decide to provide them instead, then you're lucky. But if you're not, if you have an employer who locks you up, who says you can't go out, who doesn't provide you food, this was also something that we saw during COVID-19. Some employers were not providing enough food for migrant workers who were stuck indoors. This really varied across the board, right? And this is part of the problem, I think, a structural problem, where when a lot of responsibility is given to the employer to provide for the welfare of the migrant worker, there is no standardization. The relationship becomes one that is personalized and individualized between employer and employees, rather than a state level regulation that mandates that there should be certain minimum meeting of certain minimum wages or certain minimum welfare policies, right? So, and there's also very little regulation of employers. Maybe this is due to a lack of resources, we don't know, but we see a lot of variation, right, in relation to the kind of employer because of the power they have in defining how migrant workers work and live. And this quote came from someone who's talking about how he has not been able to come out, right? Where this was in 2021 or 2020, I think, when restrictions were still not eased for migrant workers. And he talks about how everybody else, people who have PR, permanent residency, citizens, they are all going out, but the workers alone can only go out, sorry about that, once a week for 3 hours. This was when migrant workers had to apply for a pass to go out for 3 hours, and often it was only to a recreation center. Now that situation has changed. Mobility is not as restricted, but there's still, as Debbie mentioned, as I said before, there's still places that are restricted. So to go to places like Little India or Chinatown, which are important spaces for migrant workers, because that's where they meet their friends, that's where they can get food from their home countries and groceries from their home countries. Those spaces are restricted still in on certain days of the week, and you have to apply for a pass to go to those spaces, right? So this is really, there's a sense of inequality, right, that COVID brought about, that why are we being treated in one way as low-wage migrants, and why are other migrants, why are permanent resident citizens being treated in a different way? So that was a sentiment that came out a lot from the migrants I spoke to during COVID-19. However, as I said, there's also a lot of people who said, now Singaporeans know They didn't know about foreign workers' state, about the dormitory. So this COVID-19 or this circuit breaker, which is what the lockdown was called in Singapore, this lockdown actually points us to the situation we're facing, to the environment we live in, and to the sacrifices we're sacrificing each and every single day. So, and this is what I said about, there was a lot more awareness created, right? But I think we need to be careful about celebrating this too much and think about, how sustainable that is. Finally, last point I want to make is about digital media and how we saw the kind of rise of digital media used amongst migrant worker communities during COVID-19, or there was a lot more attention paid to this. So they were made immobile. A lot of them were forced to stay in one place, of course, not go out. They couldn't work. And this immobility really required new forms of surveillance and tracking of the body, right? So in some ways, these migrant women were seen as unable to manage their own biologies and their own bodies. So they were asked to often check their temperatures, report any signs of not feeling well 3 times a day. They were the only population required to do this, report this 3 times a day. And this was, so on one hand, they were seen as unable to regulate their own biological risks and their own bodies. But on the other hand, they were also forced to take on a lot of this at an individual level, right? That if they got sick, it was their own fault. And as Debbie pointed out, a lot of these restrictions on mobility, increased surveillance in the dormitories, as well as surveillance through tracking apps, has created a lot of mental health issues among migrant workers. And we saw a lot more visible cases of suicide amongst low-wage migrants during COVID-19. And on the left here, you can see this was part of a WhatsApp text message, I think, sent by the Ministry of Manpower to migrant workers. One of my friends sent this on to me, and it's in Tamil, and it talks about, how to strategies to avoid sliding into a depressive state of mind, right? Which we see more migrant workers doing. And finally, I want to just point to possibilities for advocacy and collective action that came out of this new digitization that we saw during COVID-19. So we saw a lot more apps for migrant workers being released. This is called Dorm Watch. It's to monitor movements in dorms. There's a workplace safety injury app. And of course, apps that migrants had to log on in order to record their temperature. So a lot of surveillance, digital surveillance of the migrant body, but also of the space in the community that we saw during COVID-19. In addition to digital surveillance, there was also sewage surveillance. So there was testing of fecal matter and sewage in migrant worker dormitories to check for COVID-19. And again, as I said, this started off in migrant worker dormitories, and now it's spread to other parts of Singapore. So there's regular testing of sewage in HDB housing estates, as well as of dormitories, for example, in my university, right? So a lot of this technologies of surveillance, of control, like the liquor license ban, like the sewage surveillance, starts off on migrant worker populations and is then rolled out to the Singaporean population more broadly, right? So it's a kind of migrant workers in some way act as a test case for a lot of these measures. So here, this Srinivas talks about having to check his temperature very often through apps. And here, Satya, this Indian migrant, actually says these apps allow me to access the doctor directly. Right. So through the app, they can get digital advice, like through the app, they are mediated, and the doctors can prescribe the medicine, can diagnose them through the app. So in this way, they can they don't have to go through the employer and ask for permission. Can I go to the doctor? Can you give me some money to go to the doctor? But they can go directly through the app. So in that way, maybe it displaces some of the control that employers have. But again, I don't know how widespread this is and how long these kinds of mediated technologies will be available to migrant workers, right? So we shouldn't, again, celebrate this too much. And finally, I want to point to 2 cases where social media was used as a tool for spreading knowledge about migrant worker situations, and maybe as a way to advocate as well for better conditions, right? So on the left here, we see people posting on TikTok a video of a migrant worker attempting suicide. So this again, prompted a large public outcry around mental health of migrant workers. On the right here, you can see people complaining about a migrant worker dormitory. This is Sungai Tengah Lodge, and how the conditions are really bad because people were getting bed bugs, right? So this again is a way to prompt action when going through the employer, going through official channels doesn't work. Trying to mobilize public opinion to act was seen as perhaps more successful. However, there are limits to this, right? We saw earlier this year, for example, a migrant worker advocate whose work pass was not renewed because he was accused of making a Facebook post that was not accurate and was suggesting, that mismanagement or a more extreme situation than there actually was. So there are also limits to this kind of advocacy or activism, if you will, that migrants themselves can take part in. Okay, I realize I've been talking too long, but just three points I want to leave you with, right? So first, I think, as Debbie pointed out, the structural issues persist. They're not going away. But we need to look not just at the individual sending or receiving country, because the debt issue is something that happens on both sides, right? Between sending and receiving country. It's embedded in this kind of neoliberal development model that Debbie pointed to, and global inequalities between countries, right? So this, how do we address this issue? We need embassies, we need different governments to come together. Post-COVID-19, there's more attention paid, I think, to migrant worker issues like mental health, living conditions, as Debbie pointed out, better living conditions, transportation risk, food quality. But are these just kind of band-aids on top of a larger problem? Are they masking more fundamental inequalities that are embedded in the migration system that bifurcates people and categorizes them in this way? Right. And finally, we saw that, digital media and technology has some democratic potential, but it also has a potential to increase surveillance and increase control on migrant workers. And in the end, the material conditions of their employment and work, their precarity, their ability, their kind of the fear of being deported will always structure their political positionality. So thank you so much, and look forward to your comments. And I just want to point out that 18th December is International Migrant Worker Day. And so wanted to say thank you to all the international migrants in Singapore for the work that you do. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much. You've both given us a great deal to think about. People can put questions in the chat or in the Q&A. I'm going to use my prerogative as moderator along with Anne Marie, and I think I want to start by asking what I know is a large question, but you can answer it as specifically or narrowly as you like, and maybe not surprising since I'm a political scientist. This is very much a politics framework or question, but you both ended your remarks talking a little bit about the larger structural issues and about the nature of advocacy. And I feel very American saying it that way. But so I want to know a little bit more, and this is what I'm asking. How much in Singapore is there really a domestic, let's say, political debate or disagreement about the situations that you're both describing, right? It feels to me that we have the workers, we have the employers, we have the recruiters, right? Which are three discrete sets of actors. And I have to think that there's some pushback from employers and recruiters to try and have greater regulation and greater accounting. But do you see this disagreement kind of playing out in the political sphere? Are there both advocacy groups, pushing for better conditions and better safeguarding of employment contracts and fair wages? Is there a, sort of bottom up popular? Is there any activism outside of the migrant community among Singaporean voters to do better by migrant workers? And on the government side, are there MPs who are receptive to that, right? Like, so is this really a robust kind of political issue? And of course, I'm thinking in the United States, it is a really robust political issue. We don't do very well at it, but it is a robust source of disagreement and a very loud conversation about how to deal with immigration. So I guess I'm asking if you see that playing out in Singapore, or if it's a very narrow conversation between activists and people who are passionate and concerned, and not a lot of a broader political movement. So Debbie, why don't maybe I'll start with you, and then we'll go to Laavanya, and then I think Anne-Marie wants to get into.
Okay, that was a very long question. And my answer simply would be no. There is not a broader group of people that are pushing for better conditions for migrant workers. I think Laavanya and I are involved in the two organizations that are most involved in this. As she said, there's an increased awareness about migrant workers, and that usually takes the form of charity. So there are charity organizations which will give things out but won't question the system. And both her organization and mine are well aware of the dangers of going too far. Both of us, I'm sure, know many people who have been subjected to very severe repercussions from the government for speaking out on a variety of issues. So we know activists who are not just in this field, but in a few other fields, and some will willingly take prison terms in order to make a point. Some will continue to fight out. Some have had various kinds of legal action taken against them. So we walk a fine line with that. And we know at TWC too, we speak out enough to get people to take note, but who we're really talking to is the government. But we're all aware that we could be shut down at any time, or we could feel certain personal pinches. Like Laavanya showed the picture of Jakir, who was sent back. Everyone knew that this was a political move. He was well known, well respected within the migrant community and with the Singapore community, but sending him back was sending a message to everyone that you will not speak out. You will not speak out of turn on these issues. So Singapore is a highly controlled place, and Laavanya was talking about the increased surveillance. That extends to residents as well. So the place is looking somewhat like China. They know, certainly they know where you live, where you work, where you go, who your friends are, who you communicate with. They just about know what you're thinking. And so we live with that, and we try to work within it. So, you also conflated your question with one about workers, employers, and agents. And I think that is a separate thing entirely. The agents, I think you really have to deal with, they're not quite agents. They're usually just carpetbaggers, scammers, people who befriend someone online and make promises. It's like a typical scam, so of those people who come in, I would say, about those who do get jobs, about just as many are scammed out of large amounts of money and never arrive in Singapore. So we're not talking about people with briefcases and pressed pants in offices. We're talking about people who put something online and get people to come. So among those scammers, there are people who scam people into paying for visas to Canada, the US, the UK, Australia, many other countries. And we know a lot of people who have lost great amounts of money for fake scams in those directions as well. So by recruiters, that's another issue. But I think that I'll turn it over to Laavanya to talk more about advocacy and the limits thereof
Thanks, Debbie. Yeah, maybe I'll just talk about the second issue first, because I actually think that these groups, employers, recruiters or agents, what we want to call them, and migrants, they're not discrete groups. So in my research, a lot of migrants themselves become recruiters or agents. So they charge other migrants to to find them a job in Singapore or in a host country. And they themselves may have been exploited, but they then also go on to be part of that cycle and, get charge someone else large sums of money. And when I ask this, like, why do you do this when you yourself have been through this? And they say, oh, well, someone else is going to charge them more. If I don't, if at least I know them, they can trust me. I'm not conning them out of a job. They really will have a job, but yes, I'm going to charge them $5,000. And often employers will charge migrants money to recontract them in the same job. So these categories are not necessarily discrete, right? And the recruiters also work at various levels. They might work at the village level, and then they refer you to a recruitment agent who works at the state level, and then who links you up with someone in the receiving country. So there's so many levels of recruitment that it's very hard to regulate, you see, and it's transnational as well. So and these are people who actually do end up getting a job. Yeah, the people who don't, I mean, that's even more problematic, I think. So it's a really complex problem, and it's been people have been talking about activism, scholars have been talking about it for decades, but we still haven't managed to regulate this. And I know the Indian government is trying to do something. They have licensed recruitment agents in India through which you can come, but that's only at a much higher level. Someone in the village might not have access to those agents, so they pay someone at the village level to hook them up to the agent. So there's still this debt that's incurred, you see. So and that's hard to regulate. So that's part of the problem. And in relation to advocacy, I think it's a difficult environment because, as Debbie pointed out, right, the primary concern is for citizens. So for us work, for TWC Too or home, I think one of the issues is that our base or our clients or our members are not citizens. So yes, there are MPs, members of parliament, who are sympathetic to this cause, but there's not a lot of political mileage because these people are not voters. They're temporary. They're never going to become citizens. They're not even potential citizens. So why should we prioritize their issues over the concerns of citizens? So it's not politically expedient in that sense, right? And citizens, as Debbie said, are not, I mean, there is concern at the level of, we need to improve their living conditions. So a lot of my students are very passionate about this, for example. They'll say, how can we, create an app that deals with this particular issue of like food quality, or, how can we raise money to donate used clothes or something. But, it's at the level of the kind of everyday conditions. How can we improve, rather than at the systemic level of how can we change the ways in which, these people are brought into the country and the relationships with employers, for example. So I think that's where the disconnect is. And yeah, that's my opinion, at least.
Great. Anne-Marie, I think you wanted to jump in.
I would love to. Both Debbie and Laavanya have given us so much food for thought. I have done a lot of research on Indonesia and the whole Indonesian recruitment placement system, how it's changed over time. So when you talk about these structural issues, they are so familiar to me. And when you mention the possibility of digital media, as a tool for change. I mean, what we've seen in Indonesia over the last, 15 years or so is, the ability for migrants overseas to take pictures of abuse, send it home, get it publicized in the paper in a democratic society has created huge pressure on their government to take so many steps to address the structural issues that you have discussed. So we've seen changes in the migration law to try to cut the fees, right? Make it more regulated, take out the profit motive, et cetera, so that there is much greater control. And so your both of you, your presentations were fascinating. So I guess couple of questions I could ask you questions all day. Laavanya, you mentioned just a little bit India, and as a government. Debbie, you didn't really talk about the government of Bangladesh, but I guess just a couple of questions. what is the government's attitude? I mean, are they just so happy, as Debbie, you indicated at the beginning of your talk, to get these folks out of the country, get their remittances, that they really don't care much about them? Or is there any type of effort to shift domestically the structural issues, or even to try to craft MOUs with the Singaporean government to do things like regulate wages, you now have the day off, all of those things? And if there was, would Singapore be receptive to that? So I guess that's part of a question on the structural issue. And Amy, if you can indulge me for just one other question, one other just issue, which is, you know, you had that amazing quote, Debbie, from the Minister of Manpower, right? Who cares about human rights? We just care about economics. So we know human rights issues is not going to be a, you know, useful tool to try to get them to change. But it also strikes me that Singapore does care about being perceived as good governance, right? It cares about its international image. So how, if at all, do you use that concern, or can you try to get the government to treat migrants better, even if they're not citizens, because it affects their global image? What is the government potentially responsive to on this issue? Two big questions. Thank you.
Okay, let me take the latter part first, because
Okay.
I might have forgotten some of the first part. Perceptions of Singapore, migrant workers are really useful to keep these processes going, especially in shipyard, in marine and construction. So they're low wage, but they also are a money earner for the government. There's a levy that has to be paid every month. The employer has to pay between $300 and $950 to the government. That's the levy per worker per month. So if we have 300,000 workers, you know, it would average out. I don't know how many pay at the highest level of 950, but let's say it's about, you know, I mean, it's quite a large amount. I think it's up to about 8% of the government's revenue is paid by migrant worker levies. So this is paid by the employers. So employers are, since there's no minimum salary, why should they raise it? There's no requirement to do so. But for the levy, if they don't pay the levy, they're punished by the worker being sent home. So they can only keep the workers in Singapore if they can continue paying that levy. So for the government, this is really something that they don't want to give up. And as far as perception, I think you find in some countries that have factories and sweatshops, which result in brand name clothing or coffee, or, you know, something that consumers purchase, you can say something that those companies are worried about their reputation. But in Singapore, the shipyards and the construction, it all leads back to the government. The government owns the land, the government builds the buildings, the highways, the subways, you know, they build the shipyards, they reclaim the land, all making use of migrant workers. And so the Singapore government is really not worried about this perception because they control the media. And they control the media by blacklisting any foreign publications that speak out too critically about Singapore. There was, what I heard was there was a recent Vogue Singapore article that highlighted certain well-respected activists in Singapore, and as a result, that magazine was banned. So this is Vogue, which is, you know, advertisement in clothing and jewelries. So they will make sure that this does not impact their reputation. And from Singaporeans' point of view, the question I usually get from Singaporean students is, well, if we paid them more, wouldn't we all have to be paying more for everything? So they just see this as ultimately being a cost to the average citizen. if workers get more, and as you saw on my slide, there are these various arguments that, well, they should be happy that they're given this opportunity. Nobody forced them to come. They should know the risks, those kinds of things. So I think it would be very hard to deal with Singapore's reputation, be very hard to blemish Singapore's reputation since they control the message. What was the other thing that you asked, Anne-Marie? Was about
MOUs.
What?
Memorandum of Understanding, if the Singaporean government, rather than let each employer set their own rules and stuff.
There are rules and regulations and safety nets in place, and that's all okay. There's no MOU that's going, unless it's legislated, it's not going to happen. But what was it? What was the other thing that you talked about? Oh, one thing I wanted to say about the high commissions and the embassies. Those embassies and high commissions that have domestic workers coming into Singapore, they are much more protective of those domestic workers, because these are things that really do, when they make the news, when someone is beaten, starved, abused, or killed by their employers, this is big news. And so that's a reputation Singapore doesn't want to claim. But when it's migrant workers, what we see is, like I said, low pay, bad living, working conditions, various kinds of abuse from the employer. But the accidents that happen on the construction site are not deliberate. Those are accidents, whereas the abuse of a domestic worker is usually deliberate. And so we find that among the Philippine embassy, the Indonesian embassy, Sri Lankan, even, I don't know about Myanmar, they will speak out and they will work harder for the protection of the female workers.
Thank you.
Laavanya, I'm sure you have much to add on those issues.
Yeah, thanks so much, Debbie. I think, with the issue of embassies, right? I think Debbie's right about so the I think Indonesian and the Philippine embassy, are quite active in terms of their advocacy or ways to ensure welfare, well-being of domestic workers, especially Indonesian and Filipino domestic workers. And I think the Myanmar embassy also has also indicated that they're willing to be more involved this way, because there have been a lot of cases of abuse of domestic workers. But often this is framed within an individualistic lens, right? It's individual employers who have mental health problems, individual employers who are stressed, who are causing this type of abuse, this type of mistreatment. But the system, again, of having domestic workers live in your home, be dependent on you for food, and this is not, they're completely in your personal private space, right? How can anyone ensure that you're treating this person well within this space? That structural issue is not necessarily addressed. There's some trials now for live out domestic workers. So I think there is some movement on that side, but for male migrant workers, I don't know, because if it's a gendered issue, or maybe they're seen as more professional migrants because they are covered under the Employment Act, unlike domestic workers. Maybe they're seen as having more protections that way. But yeah, there isn't as much focus, I think, on embassies. So with the Indian embassy especially, there is a lot of support for middle-class migrants, Indian migrants, because they are the ones who send back the bulk of remittances. So India is the highest remittance receiving country in the world, right? So migrants are big for India. But who are the migrants who are remitting the most money back? These low-wage migrants, they remit money back, yes, and collectively it is a large sum, but they remit very small amounts. So collectively, it's even not that large. But middle-class migrants remit far more money, like from the US, from Canada. They're remitting large sums of money back. They're investing in their home country. So this is the population that the Indian government is courting, that the Indian embassies are interested in, because they want to maintain the relationship of this middle-class community. They want them to keep investing, maintaining links with India. While the low-wage migrants, because there's no chance they're going to remain in these countries. They have to return. They cannot get citizenship or residency. So they, there's no need in some ways to court them as much because they're going to return anyway. They're going to have to remit their money anyway because their families back home. So it's also, not again, the political expediency of that. But with the Philippine embassy, we see something different because most migrants in the Philippines are low-wage migrants. They're domestic workers, they're nurses. Nurses may be more middle class, but also seafarers. The men are seafarers, and they, they're a large part of the economy as well in terms of their remittances. So there's a lot more being done for them, but on the Indian government side, not as much, I would say. So there's a lot of variation between different countries. And with the issue of, what was the issue of, what was the second point? Sorry, Anne-Marie. The first one was about MOUs.
Yeah, no, that was it. Just, the government, and I think Debbie pretty much answered, unless you have a different perception. What tool influence is potentially useful on the government of Singapore?
Well, I don't know about tool of influence, but I mean, I maybe see the media landscape as more differentiated, maybe not as controlled in that sense. I mean, of course, the mainstream media, like the Straits Times and, other kinds of, they're, very much seen as towing the kind of state line. But I think because of the internet and social media, there's just a lot more information available, a lot of different ways that information is spread. And of course, the Singaporean state is very wary of misinformation as well being spread. Like, for instance, in relation to the war in Ukraine, there was a lot of misinformation going on. So there are some legislative tools that can force people to stop spreading this type of misinformation. But I don't think, I mean, that's the nature of the media. The media means that they can't control it in the same way as you can control traditional print media or something. So I see a more diversification of the media landscape. But I think at the same time, this is like, somebody had a question in the chat on how can the US help, right? And I think, Singapore's has very strong stance on its sovereignty, right? And other states, especially states, in the West, like the US, that is seen to have a different value system, trying to impose their values or something is seen as problematic, right? So there's kind of fear of encroachment of Western liberal values, of the identity politics that characterizes American mainstream politics these days. There's the fear of that kind of encroaching. And I think so the ability of foreign governments to then put pressure on the Singaporean state, I think is within this kind of climate is very limited and could be negative in some ways, right? And I think this is something that needs to come really organically. And I think it might take time, but I think it will happen because we see we see especially young people becoming more aware, more active as well. So maybe it just takes time. And we don't have time, but like Debbie says, to change one law, it took 20 years, Debbie. So yeah.
And we haven't seen it yet.
Yeah. Well, January 2023, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So as you both have seen, there are a number of questions in the chat. So I want to try and get to some of them, and maybe I can do a little bit of condensing of some of them. So Cheryl had asked early on whether or not you think that Singapore's Ministry of Manpower only waited until the COVID publicity and the large number of cases of migrant workers to increase standards of living and think about and do something about the dorms. Is it really only to keep COVID numbers low to save face? Or was there some more genuine understanding that the conditions were substandard and needed to be improved?
I don't think that, we don't celebrate this with the dorms. So on our website, we have a series of articles called The Long Lockdown. The dorms, many of the dorms are looking somewhat like prisons, and they feel like prisons to the men. So the fact that they're slightly larger and have fewer people sharing toilets and showers we don't see that as a welcome thing. The men would all prefer to sleep outside under the sky than to be put in dorms. So I think that the government has long grappled with this issue of foreigners, because foreign workers are very visible, because on their day off, they don't stay in their dorms, they want to go out and gather. Whereas, higher paid foreigners, they don't gather in public place, out in the open, they gather in their homes, they invite people over, they go to restaurants. But when you have a large amount of men who are isolated from their community, this is exactly what they do. And when there are popular spaces for different nationalities, for the Filipinos, for the Burmese, for the Thais, for the Indonesians, for the Bangladeshis, various people gather in various places. And so the idea of men, young men, foreigners, without the sort of moderating effect of women or family members with them, they're seen as something of a threat. And I think that was even before the riots of 2013. I think that there was long an effort to think, we've got to do something about this. Now, the unauthorized dorms, they were dirty and crowded, and it's not good to be staying in those places, but they could have just, established regulations about how those places needed to be kept. But what they really wanted was to segregate this group from the local community. And so that's what we have, is this increasing segregation. And because I've been doing, working with the Bangladeshi workers for 15 years, I've seen from when I first started, a lot of people were sleeping on the streets. And I saw the effort to clear people off the streets. And then I saw more people housing them in these, in these unapproved places and crowding up those places. And then I've seen gradual movement towards dorms and more dorms being built. And most of the workers would prefer, for instance, on site, to live on the construction site rather than to live in the dorm, because there's less security. So what people want is a job, the money, but they also want to come and go. And I think that we've kind of forgotten that, these are not battery chickens who stay within their cage and, will work until they die. But this is really what it's come to, is it's almost as if they're not allowed any social life at all. So Laavanya mentioned the recreation centers. These look like prison courtyards. They are nice. They do provide things. There's some shops, barber, maybe a bank, maybe a place you can remit money, and there might be an auditorium for musical things. But there are places that no Singaporean would ever walk into unless they're people like TWC too, we want to go see. But they're situated near the dormitories in order that the men can still buy their necessities and take care of their basic needs without ever entering the community. So it's this segregation. That's why what I really like is what I do in this area where I meet people face to face, and the people that I talk to, I feel like my role is just to listen to them often, because they've never spoken to anyone who, wants to listen or even cares about their issues. Because, as I said, these are things that are normalized within the world of migrant workers. The normalization of living in dorms and doing nothing but going between the dorm and the work site. I know people who've gone for 8-10 years without a day off. And I know other people who bemoan the fact that Chinese New Year, where everything stops, where they can't work on Chinese New Year because they're missing that day of pay, or those 2 or 3 days of pay. So everyday work is what they want, because their debt comes first. Their social life comes second.
So there are 2 questions in particular that I think have relatively quick answers. So I'd like to maybe pose those to get, the very to the point questions answered. One is a question about domestic workers often have their passports taken. And the question is that practice legal through Singaporean law? And the second question about legality is the workers that you are describing, Debbie, for the most part, those workers, it sounds like, are there legally. If there are undocumented workers, are they very much at risk of deportation or being imprisoned if they don't have the proper work documents? So maybe we can get those quick answers, and then we may need to call it an evening.
Okay, Laavanya, you talk about passports. I know the answer, but you can.
It's not legal to keep your domestic workers passport, but some people still do, to restrict again their mobility, their ability to leave employers, to run away, to go to shelters like the one that Home, the NGO I work with, run. So yeah, it's illegal.
It's illegal, but it's common, and it's common among the male workers too. Very few of the male workers hold their own passports, same as the female workers. As far as the illegality, biometric passports were introduced in 2014, and before that, it was a lot easier to be illegal. And because you didn't have that passport, we knew, I think, among our clientele at the meal program, a good lot of them, maybe 1/5 to a quarter, were illegal, undocumented migrants. And for them, this was a position that was far better than being legal, because being legal, you're tied to an employer. Being illegal, you're on your own, which means you can get away with stuff. So now we still do find we have workers who are illegal, but if they're still illegal, they won't come to us. They'll come to us after they're caught. They're usually caught within a very short time because of the kind of surveillance and because of the need that people have to stay indoors. Before, when it was possible to sleep outdoors, on the streets or in parks, it was easier to hide from authorities. But a lot of these unapproved dormitories are raided at night by the police or by MOM. They have their informants who will tip them off about illegals. So if they're illegal over a certain period of time, they will be jailed. And if it's over 90 days that they've been illegal, they will be caned. But after that, they're put back on the streets, while the issue of harboring an illegal alien or employing an illegal alien, while that is investigated. And that's the perfect position to be in from the workers' point of view, because they have a past that says they're not allowed to work, but they have to remain in Singapore for the duration of this investigation, which might be 6 months. And the Ministry of Manpower is not overseeing what they do. So they can get involved in either, regular work, which is illegal, regular honest work, which is illegal, or dishonest work, which is also illegal, of course. Dishonest work meaning like sale of duty-free cigarettes, or, like fencing stolen goods, that kind of thing. But there's a chance to make money. And so one man I know he was involved in the sale of duty-free cigarettes, and his trial was coming up, and he got a lawyer merely to prolong this time before he had to go into prison. And then he spoke to me. His sentencing was coming up soon, and he said, "How can I extend this time? What if I commit another crime? Would that allow me to stay on the streets longer? Because all I need is another year of being illegal so that I can earn enough money to go back home and do what I need to do." So for him and for all workers, illegal work, or a position where you're able to work illegally without MOM breathing down your neck, is the perfect position to be in. But the immigration authorities, they also, they catch people within a short period of time.
Wow. I can't thank you both enough. You have been a tremendous wealth of information and food for thought. There are a number of questions that we didn't get to, and maybe with your permission, I can send them in an email and collect some answers and pass them on, if you would be willing to give a little more of your time as it maybe couldn't be squeezed in over the next couple of days. So thank you so much to Debbie and Laavanya and to Anne-Marie. I hope you have a great rest of your day in Singapore. And to those on the East Coast of the US, a good evening. And I think this will get posted eventually on the New York Southeast Asian Network and Columbia's Weatherhead East Asian Institute. So it should continue to get a great audience. So thank you very much.